everyone. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Daniel Edmond. I am the host of the podcast Race and Gender Unfiltered. Today, I'm really excited to be speaking with the CEO of Safer Edge, Kelsey Hoppe. We're going to be talking about equitable security. And I'm very excited to be speaking about this. It's a very current topic for me and many other people. So without further ado, it's Kelsey Hoppe, everyone.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks for having me. It's really exciting to be here and get to talk about this. This is a subject which is really close to our heart at Safer Edge. It's something we care deeply about, something we're really thinking about how we integrate in all of our advice and all of our work that we do with humanitarian and development organizations. So yeah, I'm really excited to get to talk to you a little bit more about it.
Amazing. And as I mentioned before, I've been doing quite a bit of research as well about global security and just finding out so many different things. So I just want to get straight into this because I've got a lot of thoughts and feelings towards this, and I know you do too. So to start off with, how do we all collectively own our security?
Well, I think that safety and security for most people is a really interesting topic because we don't think of it as a topic, right? So if the security system, the security that's provided to us, our safety works, we rarely think about it. We only really begin to think about it when it breaks down, when it's not working for us. And so there's an assumption that the security and the safety that's provided to us, or what we're told about our own safety and security, is true. And I think what we're seeing a little bit in the humanitarian development world specifically, but kind of larger, societal, cultural commentary is that security doesn't work for everyone. It hasn't been providing for everyone what we believe it has been. And so I think that all of us are beginning to rethink, how are we safe? Where are we safe? What does security actually mean? And what does it mean for different people who might not look like me, who might not live in the same place I do, who might not speak like I do? And so the conversation has really just opened up, and it's given this kind of space to begin to talk about equitable security rather than just security.
Yeah. And so when you say, when we think about equitable security and where may be safe for one person, where may be safe for another, I'm not sure if in our everyday lives, we're actually thinking about that, even within our own cities. I think it's a really interesting conversation, particularly being a man and hearing more of the female experiences, And so when I'm walking home at night, there may be certain things that I'm thinking about, but there will be other things that other people will be thinking about, particularly women in terms of will probably not even be on my radar.
Yes, and I think one of the things that we've seen with the recent unrest in the United States, as well as, the Black Lives Matter movement, we've seen a lot of people, begin to say out loud, I'm not safe where you think I'm safe. There's an assumption that everyone is safe in the same way in all places at all times. And so, I live in the UK, and I can be in my neighborhood, feel very safe, because the security provision there works for me. Now, there could be trafficked women living in a house down the street. My neighborhood is not safe for them. There could be children of a different race that really struggle in their own safety getting to school. And there's so many dynamics and so many kind of different aspects of our own safety, a lot of which is largely based on our own characteristics, as well as the location that we're in, that we haven't really begun to explore. And so when we talk about equitable security, we believe that there really has to be an understanding of the intersectionality of security. And I know that that's a feminist term, but our different characteristics, our race, our age, our gender, our nationality, all intersect to either keep us safe or make us insecure.
Yeah, no, that's very poignant. And I recently rewatched your TEDx talk from TEDx Bristol about where is safe. And you were saying many of these same things and themes. And I was in Jordan last year, and it was my first time being out in the Arab world. And it was so interesting because, and that's an area in a region that I've really wanted to go to for a long time. Now, I remember when we first met, I was speaking to you about going to Iraq and, in different places. And I haven't made it to Iraq yet, but was able to go to Jordan. And it was interesting when I said I was going to Jordan, the different responses people gave me of like, oh, is it safe there? And like, oh, are there going to be terrorist attacks and all these different things? And I was like, wow, it's interesting how little people know about this country and like and for those who don't know, Jordan is actually one of the safest countries in that region. And to be honest, Jordan, for me, was one of the safest countries I've ever been to, actually.
Yeah, and we really bring our own assumptions to security. So when we talk about places which are safe or unsafe, we're doing that based on our experience, based on what we've seen in the media, but also we're not really thinking about what does security in Jordan look like for someone who's a Syrian refugee or for someone who's an Iraqi refugee. And so, is Jordan a safe place for them?
100%. And that brings me in a great segue into my next question about the role the media plays in determining where we think is safe. And so I posed the question to you, what role does the media play in that perception?
Well, I think the media plays a really important role because obviously we're all information junkies now, so we're all consuming so much information and we're just consuming it from different sources. And all of those sources have a perspective and nothing is without perspective. I'm not pretending I don't have a perspective on security or, on safety in places. I obviously do. When you look at how the media presents information, you have to take into account why they're presenting it in the way they are. And for the most part, if we're talking about like television media or even online journalism or online media, often that's from the perspective of ratings, selling, getting advertising. So it's a business, and what we've all seen is that sensationalism sells. So, so putting things out there, that making it sound like it's the worst, it's the, the most dire situation.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I think the media actually plays, as you said, a pivotal role in where we believe is safe. And oftentimes when you go there to these places that you think are unsafe, I think more times than not, and particularly from other people that I've heard go to places that they thought were unsafe, more times than not, it's gonna blow your mind because it's not how it's perceived. It's not what, it's not really this, war zone that people made it out to be.
Well, and this is why the critical question that you need to ask is unsafe for whom? And this is where we don't ask that question. That question doesn't get into our policy. It doesn't get into our advocacy. And so and then there's a knee-jerk reaction when, it's, there's questions about who do the police really serve or who is safe in these locations. Everyone's up in arms because, well, safety works for me, so like, why are you saying it doesn't work for you, And so I think that the for whom question is really important. We see this in humanitarian development organizations a lot because there's a real divide between international staff traveling into a location and the security that's provided for them vis-a-vis the security which is either provided or is expected for people who live there, in the national staff that live there. And that obviously those two people would have very different perspectives on the security situation, security provision, and so on. But I think it's critical to expand that and to recognize it and to talk about it.
100%. What perspective is all of our policy and action in security based on, and why?
I think that's a really complicated question, and it's really one that we're just beginning to understand. I think that in general, security is still a very militarized concept, and not just in Western countries, in most countries. And it's a very masculine concept. It really oversteps or misses a lot of how security is really provided for most people globally. It's your grandmother walking you to school through a conflict zone because she might not be targeted.
Yeah, and I guess it's when we look at, for instance, government guidelines for traveling, and oftentimes those guidelines seem to be written for one perspective, because there are some places where I'm like, well, I feel completely safe going to this place, and then it's like, do not go, like avoid at all costs. And I'm like, well, I think it's pretty safe there. I was actually just there, So whose perspective is it usually written for when we look at government websites and stuff like that?
Well, so I would say we don't know. I mean, often we don't know. And that's, we can make some assumptions. And often the assumption that we make is it's written by someone who's thinking about my security and who knows me and is advising me. Whereas, you know, the government for the UK government, for example, they have security advisors who are usually British. Supported by national staff working in embassies overseas, whose job it is to go out and collect information and advise UK citizens visiting that place on security. Now, but the typical there is no typical UK citizen, right? There's no typical American. You know, everyone has different health issues and personal characteristics which could protect them or put them at risk. So the security advice is generally written from the perspective of that usually male Western expatriate who is in that country. Now, hopefully, like for the, you know, for governments as well as for humanitarian development organizations, there is there's additional input from people who don't look like that. But what I like to say, or like where I like to challenge organizations, is I say, what would your security advice look like if your security advisor was a Black Congolese LGBT, someone in the LGBT plus community, someone who is a lesbian, for example. And I think that the security advice we get would be really, really different because, you know, the person in the LGBT community, the person in the Black community, wouldn't be treated as an additional, oh, we need some additional advice for them because they've got some, you know, they have some additional vulnerabilities. That's when we really see who the system is built for, because the moment you start talking about people as outside the parameters of the system, requiring additional support, then you know this system wasn't built for them. You know, this advice wasn't built for them.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. What would it look like if we had policy and action based on different or multiple perspectives, like you said? What would that look like?
Well, I think kind of like what I was just talking about in some ways is that we wouldn't be having this conversation about, okay, now we've written the security advice. Now let's tailor it for other people, right? Let's talk about, let's provide security advice for those who are LGBT plus. What we would be doing instead would be, we would be giving security advice to everyone, no matter their sexual identity, right? We would be recognizing that there are risks for heterosexual people, as well as people who might identify, who might be trans or queer or lesbian. But for that to happen, I think that we have to understand where and why we're safe. And by we, I mean everyone, you know, not just ex-military men, not just the police, not just, the security guards. We all have to understand our safety and security to be able to say, hey, wait a second, this doesn't speak to me. This doesn't protect me. And again, this is one of the things I love about the Black Lives Matter movement, is because they're basically standing up and saying, we have a system that isn't protecting us. Let's talk about that. You know, this isn't equitable security that we have here.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's really interesting and very poignant, you know, because as a Black British American, you know, and understanding both cultures, it's true, you know, the security that I think some of my friends, I remember being in high school when I was just starting to drive. And, you know, we drive a bit earlier over there. So I was driving when I was like about 15, 16, driving to school. You know, you think you're all grown and everything like that. But before that, just you know, and a lot of Black families go through that. So I would say the majority of Black families in the States have to go through that when their children start to drive, about how to engage with police, you know, and it's a very interesting conversation that, you know, particularly I think I can only speak from my own experience, you know, that my parents had, because they're trying to tell you something, and the dynamic when they're telling you this about how to be secure with police, the very people who are supposed to protect you, it's one of sadness. Like, there's a sadness in what they're saying, but there's a real like sternness, and like, you need to get this, and you literally cannot leave this conversation without understanding this. And it's a moment that I think most Black people in the States have, and they will always remember the time that their parents had that conversation with them. I remember my parents being there and just telling me like how to operate with police, and, you know, and it's like, you keep your hands on the steering wheel. It's 10 and 2. It's yes, sir, no, sir. Yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. I'm going for the glove compartment. Is that okay? Are you comfortable with me reaching for the glove compartment? Yes. Okay. I'm reaching for the glove compartment now. I'm letting my hands off the wheel, going in the glove. And it's all these things. And then I was with my other friends at school, and like, they were like, no, that's that's not a thing for me at all. And like, are your parents being overprotective? Like, what is going on here? And I'm like, well, no, because it's a different situation for me as a Black person, and particularly as a Black man in the States, than it may be for some of my other friends. And I think it is speaking to what you just said. It's about like security doesn't work for everyone the same way.
No, and it's really interesting because what you were just describing, obviously, I haven't had an experience of, when I learned to drive, my parents didn't take me aside and tell me, I mean, obviously they told me pull over when a policeman, comes up.
Yeah.
There was no concern about my own security in that situation. And but I see that when we talk about women's security, when we say, I have to say, there's nothing more galling than being told by a male security trainer that be careful where you're walking at night, be aware of your surroundings, be careful when you're going to a dark parking lot and getting in your car, whatever it is, as if I haven't spent my life being very, very aware that I might be vulnerable in that situation and that I need to be cautious about that. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't people who might not have thought about it and need to be told, you need to think about these things. But in general, we're already very aware of places where we're vulnerable, because safety and security is such a base need to us. We know where we're not secure. And I probably have developed 40 different ways of managing my security that a male security manager has not even begun to think about, and in the same way that you have and your parents taught you when you're getting into that car.
Yeah. It's so interesting, when we do meet at the intersection of security and everyone's sharing their different experiences of what's safe for them and what isn't safe for them, and the different things we've all had to do to be safe in these different environments. I always find it very interesting. And so, but to speak to what you just shared, do you think we're over dependent on a typical masculine idea of security, whether that be in society or organizations?
I do. I think, and I think a little bit of that stems from simply not having questioned it, and part of it stems from, the glorification of this kind of hyper masculine view of security. Security is based on how tough you are, how much training you've had, how able you are to look and talk and, kind of be the man's man. And in some ways, I think that that's a particularly toxic view. And I know that you've talked about toxic masculinity before, but I think where we see it work out is that, we'll talk a lot about in safety and security training, we'll talk a lot about women's safety, or how do we help people in the LGBT community be safe. Again, as if, white ex-military men who, appear really tough or have lots of experience have no vulnerabilities. We don't talk about potential, a mental health, hidden mental health issues like PTSD. And what does that mean for their security? What does, the alcoholism mean? What does burnout, mean for people's security? Those are really things which, if you're in a high risk environment, especially, but really in any environment, can put you at risk. And we, I think we've done a real disservice to men in hiding those issues and making the, kind of the vulnerabilities about other things, about, being about your gender, your sexual identity, rather than saying everyone's got vulnerability.
Yeah. Well, how do we open up the conversation, about security, and how do we provide that security in a more equitable way, I would say? But like, for instance, you and I are having this conversation, and I know that you all at Safer Edge are, very interested and very passionate about having this conversation. But on a wider scale, how do we open up this conversation?
Well, I think that, conversations like this, right? So awareness raising.
Yeah.
So we need to put words to what people feel, right? So when people say security is not working for me, we need to say that's because it's inequitable, right? So security is inequitable? So why isn't it? Why is it inequitable? And how do we open up the conversation? How do we get more people involved in it? And I think that, you know, you could come up with ways from everything from a like government policy level all the way down to a school level, you know, a grade school. How do we ensure that all of the students, you know, in this local grade school feel safe? How do we make sure that we're addressing all their needs? How do we ensure that parents feel, you know, their kids are safe going to school? So once you recognize that there is an issue and you have put words to it, you can begin to say, okay, how do we address it? And you can think creatively about how you address it in each circumstance that you're talking about.
That's really interesting. You said something, putting words to how people feel. I actually think that's really important. And I'm glad you said that, you know, because I think in this conversation of equity, equality, and just I think a variety of other issues, particularly social issues, I think there are so many different feelings that people have that we don't have the language for. And I think when we don't have the language for it, it's hard to kind of concretize it. It's hard to kind of find some grounding in this. You know, you walk into a space and you feel uncomfortable and you just don't have the language as to what it is. And as soon as you get the language, you're like, oh, right, yeah, that's what it is. You know, so for in this instance, yeah, security isn't equitable. That's what it is, you know, so fully believe that. And I'm learning that more and more as I go about this journey of intersectionality, but also in terms of like trauma as well, because I think there's so many of us that deal with trauma, but because we don't have the language for it, again, we almost invalidate it for ourselves. It's like, oh, well, that wasn't, you know, sexual harassment because I don't really know what that was. And that wasn't, you know, sexual abuse because there was no penetration. So I don't have a language for what that actually is if there isn't any penetration, or there's all these different things, you know?
Yeah. And I think that creating the language or giving people space so that they can create the language for themselves is important.
Yeah, no, 100%. It is. I really think it is about just recognizing that not everyone has the same experience. You know, it kind of really boils down to that. You know, like you said, it's the intersectionality of pretty much everything. You know, wherever there are people in the mix, there is going to be some level of bias. There's going to be some level of prejudice. There's going to be some level of equity, like some conversation to be had around equity and equality, just because of this, how society is set up. So in almost every space, we have to think about, okay, this is how it is for me, but how is it for everyone else?
And I think that is okay. We're not saying that, you know, that this perspective is more valid than this perspective. It's just that there are multiple perspectives. And a lot of times we get the pushback where it's like, oh, but, you know, security threats like a carjacking or theft or robbery aren't respecters of persons. You know, they happen in the same way to everyone, and you just need to know what to do when it happens because it affects everyone the same. And I believe that's patently untrue. You know, there are certain people who are more susceptible to certain types of crime because of where they live, because of their socioeconomic status, because of their race. And that will change based on the location that they're in. As they move, their security changes. And you could have 4 people in a carjacking, and each of those people are going to be affected differently by the carjacking. Each of them are going to be able, you know, their response and what they're able to do, their capabilities in that situation are going to vary. Who the carjacker's target is going to vary based on, you know, a huge number of things. So I think it's really also important to, you know, that we don't kind of dismiss security as, well, you know, it's possible to provide for everyone in certain circumstances because, you know, the threat is so uniform.
Yeah, that's really good. Kelsey, this has been a great conversation. As always, it's always a pleasure and never a chore speaking to you, especially when it's about situations and conversations like equitable security. And so for those who are listening, where can they find out more about what you all are doing at Safer Edge?
So the best place would just be to visit our website, and that's www.saferedge.com.
Amazing. Kelsey, this has been great. Thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. Like I said, it is a very poignant conversation to be having, particularly now. And I hope that everyone listening was able to take something away from that. And please continue to have the conversations wherever you're at. For those listening, wherever you are, open up the conversation about security, open it up, the conversation about equitable security and how we can make sure that everyone is safe wherever they're going. Thank you all for tuning in. I've been speaking with CEO of Safer Edge, Kelsey Hoppy. My name is Daniel Edmond. I'm the host of Race and Gender Unfiltered. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time.